Thank you so much for inviting me to share my story of my survival of the Holocaust. I'm honored to be here. The Nazis murdered 11 million people, 6 million Jewish people, 2 million Jewish children. Only 11% survived. I was one of those very lucky children that miraculously survived. I was born in Krakow, Poland, and I lived with my mother, father, baby sister in a little town 50 miles south of the city of Krakow. I lived there with a large extended family, grandparents, cousins, aunts, uncles. I was the first grandchild in the family, so I was pampered, I was spoiled. I have really wonderful, warm memories of the first 4 years of my life. I remember preparing for holidays with my mother and my grandmother. I had an uncle who had a motorcycle with a little sidecar. He used to take me to the candy store and for rides. Well, September 1st, 1939, everything came to an end. I was just 4 years old when the war started. The first few days of the war were confusing, crazy. People didn't know what to do, where to go. My father sent me and my mother and my baby sister to my other grandparents' home in a little town nearby. And when we arrived there, everybody was packing up their belongings and running away, heading eastward in the direction of Russia. My grandfather packed some of our belongings onto a horse and wagon. I remember that ride because there were planes overhead shooting at us. We had to jump off the wagon and hide in a ditch and wait till the shooting stopped. I remember seeing an airplane that was shot down and it crashed. In the meantime, my father and my uncles tried to join the Polish army, but Poland was defeated in 1 month's time. And when that happened, my father and my uncles joined this caravan of people that was constantly streaming out of Poland into Russia. There were approximately 200,000 Polish nationals that left Poland. The conditions that we had to live under were very difficult. There was shortage of food, there was shortage of work. And one day there was an announcement made that any men who needed a job should report at the town hall. My two uncles went. My father didn't. He didn't feel well that day. When they arrived there, there was a marching band playing. They were made to sing nationalistic songs. And then they were marched to a ravine nearby, told to take off their clothes, and they were shot into the ravine. Another very tragic thing happened. My baby sister contracted diphtheria. There was no medical treatment, so she died. She was just 18 months old. After we were there for about a year, or maybe a little more, we returned back to Poland. My parents did, and I. My grandparents stayed, and one aunt and uncle stayed. The people who stayed were put onto trains and sent off to Siberia. They were sent to for slave labor. When we arrived back in our town, all the Jews were forced to live in a ghetto. All the Jews were forced to wear armbands to identify themselves as Jews. I remember one day, the Gestapo, the secret police, came to our apartment. They made everybody undress. They were looking for valuables, money, jewelry, for furs, art, and they took whatever they wanted. Also, when we first arrived, my father was arrested because they said he was a communist. So I remember my mother cooking every single day, and we would walk to jail to bring him his food. And in time, he was released. Every day there were roundups of people. Some were taken and sent off to slave labor camps. Others were taken to the local cemetery. They were made to dig their graves, and they were shot into the graves. My parents decided that we should try to escape. So one night, we left the ghetto, and we went to the train station. Train stations were notoriously dangerous because that's where the plainclothes Gestapo would often be. But we managed to take a train to another little town where my mother had relatives living. When we arrived there, it was a very similar situation because the Nazis were so well organized. My parents decided that we would try to escape one more time. My father got a horse and wagon, and we left. It was August 1942, very bright night. The moon was out. We started to drive out of town. We didn't get very far when suddenly in the distance we saw Polish police approaching. We jumped off the wagon and we started to run. You might wonder, why would we be afraid of the Polish police? The reason for that was that Poland was a very anti-Semitic country, and often the police would collaborate and cooperate with the Nazis. So we started to run. We didn't get very far, and they found us, they beat us up, and they made us return. And it became clear to my parents that there was no place to hide, no place to run, nowhere to escape. They were desperately trying to find someone who would be willing to take me. They were able to convince a woman, her name was Maria. They begged Maria to take me, and she agreed. So one day, my parents sat me down and explained that I was going with Maria, that I should be good, I should listen, and that we would be reunited very soon. So I left with her. In the meantime, there was an order issued that people from this town and all the surrounding towns had 3 days to report in an area outside of Krakow. My parents made one more decision. They decided to separate from each other. Their thinking was that if they separated, maybe, just maybe, one of them would survive. So they got to this appointed place separately, and when they arrived, there were approximately 12,000 people congregated in this big field, big meadow. It was very hot. It was August. There was no water, there was no food, and there was no place for them to sleep. And then there was a selection. A selection meant that there was a group of SS officers who made a decision who would live and who would die. Approximately 1,000 men were selected for slave labor. My father was one of those men. The rest of the people were put into 53 boxcars marked with the letter B. Between 120 and 150 people were put into each boxcar. It was so crowded, they couldn't sit or lie down. They had to stand for 5 days. The floor of each boxcar was sprinkled with a white disinfectant, and when that got wet, it gave off toxic fumes. And they were sent to the concentration camp called Belzec. 5 days it took them to get there. When they arrived, people were taken off the train. Some were already dead. The rest were taken to the gas chamber. It took only 3 hours from the time they left the train to when they were killed. This camp existed only 6 months, and in that period of time, 600,000 people were murdered. My mother was one of those victims. So was my grandmother, my aunts, my cousins, and other family members. This camp, as I said, existed 6 months. Only 2 people survived this camp. When the Nazis learned how to kill more efficiently, they opened Auschwitz. And they burned this camp to the ground. Today there's a monument and a museum standing there. I left with Maria. Maria had an apartment in Krakow. I remember so well being in that apartment because there would be times when she would go out in the evening and leave me alone, lock the door and leave me. I was really scared because there was no electricity in the apartment. So I was in a pitch black apartment, scared and crying. One day there was a sharp knock on the door. And there was an SS officer standing there. And he said, "I have orders to search your apartment to see if you're hiding any Jews." He barged in, he went into the apartment, he turned some of the furniture over. He came up to me, held up my braid. He wanted to know who I was. Maria said I was her niece, that she was taking care of me. He looked at me with his chilling blue eyes, and he turned around and he left. And to this day, I remember what he looked like. He was blonde, he had blue eyes, and he was wearing leather boots that came up to his knees. I could hear the clicking of his heels as he went down the steps. I neglected to tell you at the very beginning, throughout my childhood, my name was changed 3 different times. Also, my appearance had a lot to do with my survival. Because I was blonde, I had, light skin, green eyes, certain features. I looked like a typical Aryan child. In the meantime, my father was sent to the Krakow ghetto. Every morning at 4 o'clock, he and other prisoners were taken to a local cable factory where he worked on an assembly line. He told me the only reason he wanted to live was knowing that he gave me away and he had to find me when the war would be over. While my father was still living in the ghetto, the Nazis were building the concentration camp called Płaszów. When that camp was completed, the Krakow ghetto was liquidated, and my father went to live in the concentration camp. He knew that he had to make different arrangements for me because Maria said she could not keep me indefinitely. She was risking her life. He was able to contact a cousin who was living on falsified Polish papers. She had Polish identity. So one day, my care was transferred from Maria to my cousin. My cousin was able to obtain a birth certificate from a Catholic priest of a little Polish Catholic girl who died. And I took on her identity. I became her. Her name was Krystyna Antoszkiewicz. So that was my new name, and my nickname was Krysia. So I went to live with my cousin. There were times when we would take the trolley car in the city. She would always tell me to be quiet, to be silent, because Polish people were forbidden to ride in front of the trolley. That was reserved for Germans. But because she spoke German fluently and I didn't, that's why she told me to be quiet. We lived in another little town outside of the city. She was very mean to me, very cruel. She would beat me with a fireplace poker. And when I cried for my mother, she would say, "Your mother is dead. She's never coming back for you." Sometimes she'd go out for the whole day, leave me outside. I'd be sitting on the front stoop, cold and hungry. There was a nice lady who lived next door. Her name was Janina. Sometimes she would give me a piece of bread if I was hungry, and sometimes she would let me play with her baby. And I remember the time that my fingers were so badly injured, Janina made bandages for my fingers. One day, my cousin said she was going to the city to meet her boyfriend. She had a boyfriend that lived in the same town where we were. And so she took me with her. And when we arrived in the city, she took me into a church, and she told me to sit and wait for her while she was meeting her boyfriend in the cafe. So I sat and I waited for her and waited, but she never returned. So finally, I walked out of the church. It was late afternoon. I saw that the whole street was cordoned off. I crossed the street. There were little groups of people standing, and I overheard them say that the Gestapo had come and they arrested everybody in that cafe. So here I was, 7 years old, walking up and down the street, crying. I didn't know what to do. Suddenly, a woman came up to me, and she kind of put me under her cape. And she said, "What's wrong? Why are you crying?" I explained that my cousin was in the cafe, and now she was gone. I said, "Could you please take me to the bus stop? I was going to go back to my village." And she said, "No, you're too little." So she took me into the building, the same building where the cafe was, but upstairs to the apartment of a woman by the name of Alicja Gołąb. Alicja asked me, "Who are you? Where are you from? What happened?" I had a story that I practiced to tell if I was ever captured. So I told her that I was the daughter of a Polish officer and that both of my parents were killed in a bombing raid. And now I was being taken care of by my cousin, and she was gone. Alicja said I could stay, but actually I could not stay in that apartment for 3 reasons. One was that there was an SS officer living in the apartment building. Another reason was that Alicja's mother was very active in the Polish resistance, and in her apartment she ran a hospital, she had shortwave radios and ammunition. And the third reason was when the Gestapo made an arrest, they would always return. So so they were afraid to keep me there. So that early evening, the oldest son took me, and we walked for several miles, and we came to a farm that was owned and operated by the Catholic Church. Alicia's brother-in-law was the administrator of this farm. So I remained on the farm. I remember one day we had slaughtered a pig. Polish people were forbidden to kill animals for their own consumption, but they had just slaughtered the pig and they were cutting up the carcass in the kitchen. The kitchen was a big mess. Suddenly there was a knock on the door. Someone came to tell us that the Gestapo was on the way. It was not unusual for them to come. They would just drop in to pick up cheese, butter, eggs. We quickly cleaned everything up and hid everything in the attic. And we waited. And they came. And when they came, I was really scared because I was always afraid of uniforms. And I don't know what made me do this, but I said, give them vodka. So they were drinking, and then I started to sing and dance. So they were drinking and laughing at me and somewhat amused, and finally they left. My dad told of a story, told me something happened to him in the concentration camp. One night, in the middle of the night, he had to use the bathroom outside. He found a cigarette stub, and he was smoking. A guard saw him and shot him in the face. The bullet lodged under his cheekbone and just stopped there. When the Nazis realized that they were losing the war, they wanted to destroy any evidence. So they had the prisoners dig up the very shallow graves all over this camp. There were thousands and thousands of bodies. My father's job was to dig up the bodies, put them in a big pile, and burn them. He said he could not get the smell out of his nostrils of the burning bodies for many, many years. When that job was completed, the Nazis burned the camp to the ground. Today, there's just a monument standing there. We were liberated by the Russians. Now, my father ended up in 3 different concentration camps. I remember when the war was coming to an end because they were fighting all around the farm, and we too had to use the outhouse, so we were risking our lives. When the war ended, my cousin's father found me. He came to get me. I really didn't want to go with him because I was afraid of him, just the way I was afraid of his daughter. But the family didn't feel they had a right to keep me because he was my relative. So I left with him. He did not keep me very long. He turned me over to a refugee center in Krakow. I was 10 years old when the war ended, and I was there with about 70 children. There weren't that many boys because Jewish boys had been circumcised. And some of the boys were wearing dresses to disguise their identity. Every day there were lists posted on the wall with names of survivors. So you can imagine that the survivors coming out of hiding, coming out of camps, they were sick, they were malnourished, they had no money, they had no clothing. So this was a place where they could get some help. So that's where I went to live. Along came a woman, her name was Lena Koehler. She came every day looking at the list, trying to find her family, her child and husband and sister, and she came across this room full of children and made a decision that she was going to do something for the children. So in time, she was able to open 2 orphanages. I remember so well the night we left for the orphanage. We had to leave in the middle of the night because there were men and women picketing in front of the refugee center, carrying hateful slogans saying that we all should have been murdered. So we left in the middle of the night. We climbed into the trucks. One of the trucks was for children who had tuberculosis and other very serious diseases. The Polish hospitals refused to take Jewish children. So that's why they had to open the second orphanage. So I went to live in the orphanage. Only the high school-aged children were sent to public school. But every day they came back, they were beaten up by the Polish kids. Lena went to the school pleading with the principal and teachers to protect the children, but they didn't. Lena was always afraid that our home would be attacked because the other orphanage was attacked 3 different times. And finally it was decided that it was too dangerous to keep it open. They closed it, and those children came to live with us. And because Lena was so afraid that our home would be attacked, she obtained ammunition. And the older children were trained in use of ammunition. One night, a Polish lady knocked on the door. She came to tell us that our home was going to be attacked. So the children took their positions on the roof and on the balcony, and they waited. And in the middle of the night, Polish men came. They were on horseback. They were carrying fire torches, and they were shooting. But the children were able to protect the home. One day, Lena went back to Krakow to pick up some provisions, and she overheard a man asking about his child. She said to him, "Can you describe what your daughter looks like?" And when he did, she said, "I think I have your daughter." She came back to the orphanage. She called me down to her office and said, "I have wonderful news for you. Your father has survived." I will always remember the reunion with my dad, because when I first saw him, I was so afraid of him. He looked like a skeleton. He was hugging and kissing me and telling me he was going to take me. I actually didn't want to go with him, because for the first time, I had friends, and Lena was our mother. We called her mother. My father was very sick. He could not take me right away. He rented a room nearby. He got stronger. He gained weight. I would see him every single day. We got reacquainted, and in time he was able to take me. And we went back to our town. We lived with several of my father's friends who survived above my grandparents' store. But we weren't safe there either. There were notes posted on our front door saying, "We will be murdered." Several of my father's friends were murdered after the war. Young men driving in a car, they were ambushed and shot. My father went to the police chief asking for protection, and the police chief told him all he could do is to give him a gun. So my father slept with a gun. And it became pretty clear that we really couldn't stay in our town. It was too dangerous. So we left, and we moved back to Krakow. And after a while, my father made a decision that we had no future in Poland. We weren't welcome. We weren't wanted. We could not get our property back. Poland was one big morgue. So he had 2 brothers. One was in Palestine and one was in this country. And he came up to me and said, "Where do you want to go?" And I said, "I want to go to America because I heard that money grew on trees." So it was not a simple matter as packing up our bags and leaving. It took about 2 years to get our documentation. We had distant relatives in New Jersey who sent us the documents that basically stated that if my father couldn't support himself and support me, that the family would take care of us so that we would never become a burden to this country and have to go on public assistance. So in March of 1947, we came on a marine transport boat. It was very rough crossing because the Atlantic is stormy in March. All the boys and men slept on one deck, and all the girls and women slept on a different deck. I really was enchanted with vending machines, because I would put in a nickel and get a Milky Way, and in those days they were really good size. The other food that I loved was red Jell-O. I thought it was magical food. So we settled in New Jersey. My uncle took me to school. I had never been to school. I knew how to read and write in Polish, but I did not speak English. He took me to an elementary school, and right there in the school office, he said, "What name do you want? You have to have an American name." So I thought for a minute, and I came up with the name Jeanette, because we had a cousin who lived in Paris, France. She used to visit in the summertime. She was very beautiful, very glamorous. She had long red nails, and her name was Jeanette. So I said Jeanette, and he said, "No, in English it's Janet." So that's how I became Janet. And so this was April of the school year, and I was put in a 5th, 6th grade. But by June, I was promoted to 7th grade, and I turned 12 in June, so that was the correct grade for me. But we had another really serious problem. We came on a 90-day visitor's visa. At the end of 90 days, we had another visa to go to Venezuela. The only way we could remain in this country is if my father married an American citizen. So you do what you have to do. The family found him a wife. So in that short period of time, I had a new stepmother, a new name, new language, new appearance. They cut my hair, new friends. Everything was new. I remember my 8th grade teacher always referred to me as that little foreign girl. Here I was trying to fit in, not stand out, but that's how she identified me. I was very lucky because I had a wonderful group of girlfriends who kind of took me under their wing and really helped me, socialized me. And then, of course, I went off to high school, and I was active, I was a good student, and I did well, and then off to college. But at age 19, I got married. In those days, some of you may remember that, young women married very young. I promised my parents I would finish college, and I kept my promise. I carried a baby to class. It was very hard. When I speak to students, I say, I don't recommend it. It's too young to get married. And then later on, I continued my education. I got my master's. So today, I have 3 incredible children, 5 incredible grandchildren, and I know when I'm no longer here that my legacy will continue because they will continue to tell my story. Because I'm a witness of history, and all the people who have heard me are all witnesses. I have often thought about the people who saved my life. They didn't just save one life, they saved future generations. And I'm so grateful. They are the true heroes. And it has made me think about the kinds of decisions and choices that people make, because even the smallest acts of kindness have a ripple effect. I'm grateful to Facing History and ourselves, and very pleased to be part of their mission. And I hope that, because people make choices, but choices make history. And I hope that each and every one of us will continue to stand up to any kind of discrimination or injustice. Thank you so much.